In last week's episode 29 of Inside the 20, I did a mock draft from the 3 spot in a 12-team PPR league, and I did my best to open up my brain and provide every thought that was going through my head, providing plenty of strategy, analysis, and insight with every single pick. And afterwards, I was completely blown away by the positive responses and so many of kind words from each of you that reached out to let me know, hey man, we want to see more of this stuff going forward. So I'm sure you can guess what today's episode 30, my birthday episode, by the way, keep listening for a special promotion that you can take advantage of. But in today's episode 30 of Inside the 20, we're going to do another mock draft. But this time, we're going to go to the other side of the draft board, drafting from the 10 spot in a 12-team PPR league. And just like last time, I'm going to do my best to completely open up my brain and explain every single thought that's running through my head with every single selection. And one thing we're going to start doing in today's episode is incorporating questions from you, the audience. So if you have any questions for future episodes, definitely feel free to leave them in the comments below. But let's dive into this mock draft from the 10 spot in a 12-team PPR league right here, right now, in episode 30 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Alright, so just like last time, I set this thing up to reflect a pretty typical fantasy football league in 2024. It's a 12-team league with PPR scoring, starting 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 flex. We're going to go about, I think, 15 rounds is what it's set for, which is, again, pretty typical for 2024 fantasy football leagues. Now, candidly, being in the 10 spot of this draft, I can pretty much all but guarantee you, even though this draft hasn't even started yet, that after about 6 rounds or so, this team is most likely going to have 1, maybe 2 running backs, and probably about 4 wide receivers. And the reason that I already know this, even though this draft hasn't even started, is because I have already done well over 200 very real best ball drafts with skin in the game against real fantasy football players over on drafters.com, which is where I play 100% of my best ball these days. If you're not familiar with a best ball draft, feel free to press pause on this episode, refer back to episode 10, where I did an introduction and a primer explaining what best ball is and why it's my favorite format of fantasy football, because it's draft only. There's 0 in-season maintenance. You quite literally can't set a lineup. You can't add players, can't drop players, can't trade players. You only draft, which is my favorite part of fantasy football to begin with. Really quickly, if you're wondering why drafters.com is my best ball platform of choice, there's really 3 main reasons. Number 1, the ADP is really friendly. The ADP is really soft. There's money to be won. There's prizes and tournaments to be won. Number 2, you can do a fast draft, which is 30 seconds per pick, or you can just rack up a whole bunch of slow drafts all at once, because slow drafts allow up to 8 hours per pick. I literally have over 40 drafts going right now as we speak. And number 3, you can join contests for as low as $1.10. Easy platform to play on. You can play on desktop or PC. You can play on the mobile app. And if you're the type of person who enjoys doing a mock draft to get ready for 2024 fantasy football season, I highly recommend instead doing best ball drafts, because they're just like mock drafts, but with a little bit of skin in the game, a little bit more fun. If you want to give Drafters a try, I left a link for you down below in the show notes, and if you enter promo code BBFF when you're making your first deposit, Drafters is going to 100% match your first deposit up to $100. It's like you have a free $100 to play fantasy football with. Use promo code BBFF when making that first deposit. Because I have done well over 200 very real drafts, I already have a built-in knowledge or a built-in understanding of what players go in what rounds. And that really helps me make my early round selections when I already know, in theory, which players should be available to me in the later rounds. It really helps me have an understanding of strong roster construction before the draft even begins. And all of that, by the way, is knowledge that I bake into my 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, which is something that I make available to all my subscribers. And it's something we're going to be using frequently throughout today's episode, which, by the way, I mentioned in the intro that this episode is my birthday episode. My birthday is on Sunday. It's August 4th. I'm leaving year 35 in the past. I'm moving into year 36, and I want to celebrate. So in order to celebrate, because I can't bring the entire class cupcakes, I'm doing a little bit of a promotion for the remainder of this weekend. Anybody between now and Sunday night, basically midnight going into Monday morning, anybody who joins Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server, which is an online community, it's got 163 and counting fantasy football players that are in there helping each other conquer tough decisions, dominate their leagues, costs less than 1 beer per month. Anybody who joins that Discord server is automatically going to receive a promo code that they can enter on basementbrewedff.com that is going to take 36% off of BBFF's cheat sheets. Our draft guide, which you're looking at here, which we'll talk about plenty in today's episode. Our heat maps, which is what started this entire business. You're going to see plenty of that in today's episode, I'm sure. Anybody who joins BBFF's Discord server automatically gets 36% off the draft guide and or the heat maps moving forward. But without further ado, let's dive into this mock draft. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. All right, so for those listening via podcast and not able to see the board on YouTube, the first 9 picks went pretty typical, about what you would expect in 2024, maybe a little bit of a surprise at pick number 9. But we went Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson with the first 5, A.J. Brown, Bijan Robinson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jahmyr Gibbs at number 9, which that's a little bit of a surprise. Usually he goes around 11 or 12, so 2 picks ahead of where he's supposed to go. Now, for me, this one is going to be a little bit of a no-brainer because when I do reference Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, which I've already updated, I've deleted the first 9 players that went before me. If you're seeing this on the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, we are draft spot 10, so all you have to do when you're using Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide is update that. When you open it, it'll start at number 1, you just change it to 10, and your next draft pick, which is number 10, and you'll see over on the right, it's going to give you a handy-dandy upcoming picks tracker so you know that we're going to be picking at 15, 34, 39, 58, 63, 82. That helps us moving forward. That helps us kind of plan ahead a little bit because BBFF's draft guide also has an ADP column that's going to help give you an understanding of where these guys are usually drafted in their real draft. So for example, if I know my next pick after 15 is around pick 34, I can start looking at some of the names, some of the numbers around 34 to give myself a little bit of an idea of who's going to be available around pick 34. Now, one quick caveat, one quick note, and I did mention this in the last episode, is you should always, rule of thumb, be aware of the ADP, the average draft position, of the platform that you're playing on. Sleeper has their own ADP, and it's probably going to look different than Underdog, and Drafters, and DraftKings, and Yahoo, and ESPN, and NFL, and CBS. So be aware of where you're playing and how the ADP of that platform might influence your opponent's selections moving forward. Anyways, back to our first pick. Now, this one's going to be very easy. This one's going to be a no-brainer because when you reference Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, you'll see that I've conveniently not only ranked 250-plus players, but I've also included tiers for all of the players. And this is helpful for planning ahead. This is helpful for helping you batch players of similar value together. And as you can see with this pick, we literally only have one player left in the best available tier, tier 2, and that pick is Breece Hall. And I'm especially okay with this selection. By the way, I'm okay with somebody going Puka Nacua or Garrett Wilson here. I've done it myself at pick 10, so that totally changes how the rest of this draft might go. But in this case, I am more than happy to take Breece Hall with the 10th overall pick because A, Breece Hall is a very legitimate candidate to be the number one RB in all of fantasy football this year. But B, the next several rounds, as you're about to find out, rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, are going to be loaded with wide receivers. I think there's a very good chance that unless Derrick Henry is available in the 3rd round, we will be going Breece Hall, wide receiver, wide receiver, wide receiver, wide receiver. But without further ado, let's make the actual pick. Breece Hall it is. All right, so after I took Breece Hall at the 10th pick in the 1st round, after that there were 2 teams to make selections. Team 11 picked Puka Nacua and then Jonathan Taylor, and Team 12 picked Garrett Wilson and Kyron Williams. Now, candidly, there's not really too much to say about this next pick. When we flip over to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, which again I've updated with the 4 picks that followed my own selection, you'll see that the best remaining players in the best available tier, all 4 of them are wide receivers in Drake London, Davante Adams, Chris Olave, and Marvin Harrison. The fact that they're all in the tier effectively means that, in my opinion, you could basically just flip a coin and end up with the same value type of player. But if you're just one of those people that just can't quite make a decision and you need somebody to tell you what to do, well, I did also rank all these players from top to bottom, so you could always just go top to bottom. Ultimately, that's what we're going to be doing here. I love Davante Adams this year with Gardner Minshew at quarterback. I love Chris Olave with the offensive coordinator coaching changes. Marvin Harrison should get all the targets he can handle from Kyler Murray, but you know, if you missed episode 13, we talked about Kirk Cousins going to the Atlanta Falcons, and we talked at great length about what Kirk Cousins does for his pass catchers, specifically his wide receivers. You can always refer back to episode 13, but we're going to keep this quick, painless, and simple. We're just going to go ahead and draft Drake London, the top-ranked available player in the draft guide, and now we have our RB1 and our wide receiver 1. All right, we are back on the clock with the 10th pick in the 3rd round, officially pick number 34 overall. And this is where the draft really starts to get fun for degenerates like me who have done 200 plus real fantasy football drafts already this summer, and it's not even August. And this is going to sound a little bit familiar if you looked at last week's episode, but it does bear repeating. When you play on free / let's just call them casual, which is okay, websites like Sleeper, like Yahoo, like ESPN, where the majority of people play and they do it casually, the ADP on those websites tends to be a little bit soft because there's not as many sharks in the water as underdogs or on drafters or on DraftKings, for example. One quick example that I'll give you right now is, if you can see on the screen, Cooper Kupp is the number 42 player on Sleeper, meaning he's going around pick 42 overall, okay? That is early 4th round on Cooper Kupp. And for context, Cooper Kupp usually is not making it out of the 2nd round on drafters.com. So we're talking about a 1.5 round difference just going from drafters over to Sleeper. And drafters, by the way, is a PPR platform, just like we're doing right now on Sleeper. This is also a PPR draft, and Cooper Kupp has an ADP of 42. Now, I expect that to climb over the next few weeks and people start to get into their drafts, but it's another good reminder, another good example of A, how you should be aware of the ADP of the platform that you're playing on, and B, the time of year, the time of season that you're drafting. If you're drafting early in August, you can take advantage a lot of these soft ADPs, and if you're drafting later in August, I'm guessing Cooper Kupp's ADP is going to look a lot different. Now, we're going to get a little bit cute with this selection. When you look at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, I've updated everything. I've deleted the 20 or so players that were drafted after I took Drake London. They are gone. I've updated the pick counter, knowing that we are now on pick number 34, and you'll see that the 2 remaining players in the best available tier are Cooper Kupp and Jalen Waddle. Now, I want Cooper Kupp more than I want Jalen Waddle. However, I want to maximize upside. I want to do everything I can to absolutely dominate and destroy this draft. So I'm going to try and get not one, but both of those guys. And again, this is going to be another great example of why one should pay attention to A, the platform that you're playing on, and B, what your opponents have done with their draft. So starting with the platform that we're playing on, I told you my targets. I'll star them here to make it easy to find. Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp. Now, Sleeper is really cool because it provides these lines that show where your next pick is going to be. And if you'll see here, Jalen Waddle is the number 2 ranked player available in Sleeper's remaining players list. Meaning, if I don't take Jalen Waddle here, there's 4 picks before I'm back on the clock. There's a pretty good chance that one of the 2 teams after me is going to take Jalen Waddle. On the other hand, Cooper Kupp is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 players down Sleeper's list. So even though Cooper Kupp is at the very top of BBFF's draft guide, I'm not taking Cooper Kupp. I'm going to take Jalen Waddle and just cross my fingers that Cooper Kupp is going to come right back to me in the 4th round. The other thing that I'll mention here, and this is why it's important to pay attention to what your opponents are doing with their rosters. Both of the teams that are drafting behind me, Team 11 and Team 12, already have LA Rams on their roster. So Team 11 chose Puka Nacua in the 1st round of their draft. Now, there is something to be said about stacking players, and I'm not sure if I want to dive into all of that right here, right now. That could be an entire episode. But typically, stacking is a very, very effective way of maximizing your upside. If you're playing in some sort of league or tournament or contest that has a ton of entries, because you want to capitalize and you want to maximize the amount of upside that you get on teams that are going to score a lot of points. However, in a regular 12-team or redraft league, a lot of people are pretty uncomfortable starting both Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp in their lineup at the same time. Although those are 2 wide receivers where you absolutely can start both guys in the same lineup in the same week. But again, that's a conversation for a different time. Meanwhile, team number 12 has Kyren Williams. They already have the Rams Rams running back. The point is, a lot of times human beings, and one of the most frequent questions I get on Twitter and everywhere else that I hang out is whether or not you should grab players from the same team, from the same offense. And quite frankly, there's a lot of fantasy football players out there that are very, very uncomfortable having 2 players from the same offense inside their starting lineup, which inherently makes sense, right? If Kyren Williams is getting the ball, then Cooper Kupp can't get the ball. Okay, so it makes sense, and that's just the way that some fantasy football players think. There's a whole nother counterpoint to this that we'll talk about at a later time. Not here, this episode's already getting long-winded, but thinking about how opponents think, thinking about how other human beings think about their own fantasy teams, I know that there's a good chance that the 2 players behind me might be uncomfortable taking another Ram, a 3rd Ram, or a 2nd Ram in 3 picks. I'm going to roll the dice, take Jalen Waddle, and take my chances that Cooper Kupp's going to come right back around in the 4th round. Worked like a charm. We are back on the clock with the 3rd pick in round 4, officially pick 39. The 4 picks following me taking Jalen Waddle went Isaiah Pacheco, Malik Neighbors, Patrick Mahomes, and Lamar Jackson. And of course, Mr. Cooper Kupp is still on the board. This is going to be a no-brainer of a selection. Cooper Kupp, when we flip over to BBFF's draft guide, we see that Cooper Kupp is still in a tier of his own. He's the best remaining player. He's the only player left in the best available tier, and he's the number 1 wide receiver among a massive stretch of wide receivers that look like they're coming down the line. This is going to be an easy pick, especially if you listen to episode 27. I recently did a fantasy football preview of every Los Angeles Rams on the team, and Cooper Kupp is somebody I've been hammering, I've been smashing all summer long. This is an easy pick, probably the easiest one that we'll get all draft. All right, we are back on the clock with the 10th pick in the 5th round. I've updated the pick tracker to know we are now on pick 58. Coming up, we have picks 63, 82, 87, 106, 111, and 130. Now, after I chose Cooper Kupp as my number 3 wide receiver, I just started foaming at the mouth when I said that, we saw a little bit of a tight end run happen in the remainder of round 4 and beginning of round 5. We saw 4 different tight ends come off the board in Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, and Kyle Pitts. And that's not uncommon. That is typical for 2024 fantasy football drafts, where we do see 6 tight ends come off the board in the first 5 rounds. It's a much deeper position than in years past. You can exit round 4, round 5 with a pretty solid, pretty strong option as your number 1 tight end. Now, with that tight end depth in mind, this is a perfect spot to bring in our first audience question for Inside the 20. Again, if you have any questions that you want me to address in future episodes, drop them in the comments below and they might make it in. Of course, priority belongs to subscribers of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football Discord server. Speaking of which, Crazy Taco, which is the greatest screen name ever, Crazy Taco wants to know, do you see any viability in a bully tight end build when flex spots allow tight end inclusion with the amount of solid options that are on the market? Now, if you're familiar with the concept of bully tight end, basically what that means is using 2 pretty early draft picks on 2 different stud tight ends and using one of them in your flex position all year long. Now, one train of thought with that, which makes it, and it's a valid train of thought, is that in some ways you are playing defense, for lack of a better term, against your 11 other opponents by removing a tight end, which has traditionally been the thinnest position in all of fantasy football. And now if you're taking 2 stud tight ends, you're removing one of them, which is already hard to find, from the pool of players, from the pool of tight ends that the other 11 players in your league are forced to choose from. That's why it's called bully. You're stealing all the tight ends when all the other 11 players in your league need to figure out a tight end that they need to start every week. Tight end traditionally has been a brutal position, and now if you're taking 2 of them, you're really thinning out that pool even more. Now, the trick with that is, I just finished mentioning that the tight end pool has gotten a little bit stronger in 2024. And by Crazy Taco's own, that sounds funny to say, by his own question, there's a lot more solid options on the market this year, which means when you have significant supply, there's less demand. So you're hurting your teammates less when you're taking 2 stud tight ends, because theoretically they will be able to find some options. And if, they're Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers, they're going to have access to the heat map, which allows them to identify tight end streamers every week. But we'll get to that when the time comes. But just some data for you to consider. The biggest problem with a tight end bully type of build in 2024 is the opportunity cost that comes with that. So last year's number 1 and number 2 tight ends were Sam Laporta and Evan Ingram. Both of those guys averaged just about 14 PPR points per game. And that's solid, right? You'll take 14 PPR points per game out of your flex position. I get that. Of course, you would have had to get both of those guys in last year's draft. You would have had to guess that correctly. And in all likelihood, most people didn't, because Sam Laporta was drafted as fantasy's number 18 tight end in the mid-14th round. Evan Ingram was fantasy's number 8 tight end in the early 8th round. Okay, so we're already talking about a difference, but the difference between taking, say, Travis Kelce and Sam Laporta, this year's number 1 and number 2 tight end, versus last year's, who ended up as last year's number 1 and 2 tight end, Sam Laporta, Evan Ingram. You have to get it correct for this strategy to even have a chance at working. And then even if it does work, even if you do get the tight end 1, tight end 2, both guys averaged about 14 PPR points per game, that means in the range that Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce are drafted in 2024 drafts, you'll see they went in the 2nd round, they went in the 3rd round, and if you were to take both of those guys in the 2nd and 3rd round, you are sacrificing the opportunity to take a RB, a running back that averages around 15 to 16 PPR points per game. Usually the running back 11 and 12 is drafted in that range. They average about 15 to 16 PPR points per game. And you're sacrificing the chance to take the wide receiver 13-14 that averages about 16 or 17 PPR points per game in exchange for a tight end that's going to get you about 14. And then beyond that, there's a whole trickle down effect that goes deeper when you're trying to fill out your lineup and get your RB1, your RB2, your wide receiver 1, 2, 3. So for example, let's just take the pick 24-25 turn, right? That's around where Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce, this year's tight end 1 and tight end 2, that's around where they go, okay? So if you were to use your pick 24 and 25 on Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce and go with this bully tight end, you're getting about 14 PPR points per game out of both those guys, theoretically. When instead, like I mentioned, you could have had a running back that gets you 15 to 16 PPR points per game and or a wide receiver that gets you 16 to 17 PPR points per game. But again, let's assume you went with the tight ends, meaning your next several picks need to be running backs and wide receivers to try and make up for and fill the holes that are now on your roster. A wide receiver drafted around pick 24 averages about 15 to 16 points per game. A wide receiver drafted around pick 48 averages about 14 PPR points per game. So you're going from 16, 17 down to 14. And that's just for your first wide receiver, when you have to wait until pick 48 to get there. And then when you have to wait again from 48 to 72, it goes from 14 PPR points down to 12 PPR points. And then when you have to wait again from 72 to 96, it goes from 12 PPR points to 11 PPR points. And it's the same thing for running backs. The running back that goes around pick 24 averages about 15 to 16 PPR points per game. But if you have to wait from pick 24 to pick 48, that drops from 15, 16 down to 14. And if you have to wait again from 48 to 72, it drops from 14 to 12. And if you have to wait again from 72 to 96, it drops from 12 to 11. And all of this, by the way, is best case scenario. That's assuming you nail every single draft pick. It's assuming you nail pick 48, 49, 72, 73, 96, 97. That's assuming you crush it and get the absolutely correct running back and wide receiver in those spots. So the point is, you have a lot more spots to fill when it comes to wide receivers, running backs, than you do tight ends. Tight ends, you only really need to start one, whereas a wide receiver could take up about 50% of your starting lineup. There's a lot more space that you need to fill from a wide receiver and from a running back standpoint. It's just not optimal to take two different tight ends when you have so many other places to fill, especially because the tight end market is so deep this year. Can it work? Absolutely. If you get a guy averaging 14 PPR points per game in your flex spot, you might be okay. But is it optimal for 2024 fantasy football? Absolutely not. Crazy Taco, my man, thank you for the question. Hopefully that helps. Again, if you have any questions for future episodes, drop them in the comments and they might make them into the show. But let's get back to this mock draft. And quite frankly, this is going to be a pretty easy pick for me. If you listen to episode 25 when I did a fantasy football preview of the Cincinnati Bengals, then you know I absolutely love me some T. Higgins this year. And he's usually going in the middle of the 4th round of best ball drafts. So to be able to get him with the 10th pick of the 5th round, it's a no-brainer. I'm all in on T. Higgins with this pick, even though Christian Kirk is apparently still on the board. He is, but I mean, if you look at the lines here, again, you look at Sleeper's ADP, there's a chance that I can grab him with my next pick, although we'll have to cross that bridge when we get there. Right now, we're going to go ahead and scoop up some T. Higgins with this selection. All right, we are back on the clock with the 3rd pick, round 6. Pick, what are we on officially? Pick 63 overall. Our upcoming picks are going to be 82, 87, 106, 111, 130, and 135. Now, candidly, my number one target in this list is gone. George Kittle. If you listen to episode, I think that was 28, I'm all about George Kittle. I think he's a steal in 2024 fantasy football drafts. However, he was literally selected the very pick after I picked T. Higgins, so now he is off the board, leaving us with an interesting decision that we need to make. Now, after 5 rounds, we got Breece Hall holding down the number 1 running back spot. Love that. We got Drake London in our wide receiver 1 spot, Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 2, Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 3. And then we still have T. Higgins, who is more than capable of occupying that flex spot as long as he's healthy, as long as he's on the football field. Now, the reason we have a decision to make here is because you'll see if you flip over to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, you see we're still swimming in a sea of wide receivers that, quite frankly, I would love to have on my team. Namely, guys like Christian Kirk, who's the best available player. He's in a tier to himself. He's the lone remaining player in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's best available tier. But also Marquise Brown, who I love with Patrick Mahomes. Jaden Reed, who's a fantasy football stud in the making. And shoot, over here, when you look at the draft column of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, you'll see that these guys are literally reaching steal territory, meaning they're falling way past their ADP. Christian Kirk was supposed to be drafted around pick 41. Marquise Brown was supposed to be drafted around pick 51. Jaden Reed, 56. And we're on 63. These guys are falling well below their average draft position. And it's really, really tempting to take these guys because I love them. However, as I mentioned in the last episode, one of the biggest mistakes that fantasy football players make is falling in love with specific players and with specific names. So as much as I absolutely love Christian Kirk, I'm not going to be taking Christian Kirk here. Same thing with Marquise Brown. Now, I wouldn't fault somebody for taking Christian Kirk here. Of course I wouldn't. He's the top-ranked player available in my draft guide. He's in a tier all to himself in my draft guide. And I would not fault... I would be totally okay with somebody taking Christian Kirk here and then basically just playing matchups between T. Higgins versus Christian Kirk in the flex spot basically every single week. However, knowing that the running back pool is about to hit a stretch of strong running backs, but it thins out pretty quickly at come round, let's say 9. This is a spot where I'm going to hop multiple tiers. I'm going to hop out of tier 7, 8, 9, and 10 to hop into tier 11, where you're going to see a pretty massive batch of running backs. If you listen to episode 18, you'll know that I'm high on David Montgomery because he offers standalone flex, RB2 flex value, even when Jahmyr Gibbs is on the field. But then when Jahmyr Gibbs is not on the field, there is league-winning upside if David Montgomery is able to run as Detroit's only running back in that offense, should, God forbid, anything ever happen to Jahmyr Gibbs. We are going to jump some tiers here, and we're going to take David Montgomery with this next selection. All right, we are back on the clock with the 10th pick in round 7, pick 82 overall. And one thing I forgot to mention with our last pick, when we picked David Montgomery, one of the other options, one of the other choices for us, we talked about Christian Kirk and one of the wide receivers. We talked a little bit about George Kittle. We did not talk about quarterback. And you may have noticed that Anthony Richardson was pretty high up in the rankings. He was pretty high up in the list, and he should have been on our radar. He was somebody I was considering, but before I pressed the record button, I had decided, and forgot to tell you about it, I had decided that I was going to pass on quarterback in that round because I knew here in round 7, we might be able to find Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, Kyler Murray. I knew there was a pretty good chance I'd be able to get a strong quarterback in the 7th round. And just to be crystal clear here, this is usually about the end. 7th round, 8th round is about the end of the stretch of every week QB1s, meaning anybody after this round is usually going to be a guy that you'd feel more comfortable streaming than you'd feel better putting in your starting lineup every single week. So ultimately, if you're going to try and start the same quarterback every single week, I wouldn't let it go past the Kyler Murray, Jordan Love tier. Save for Brock Purdy. He belongs in that conversation as well. But once we start getting down to Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, that's usually about the end of the road as far as every week QB1 goes. Now, there's plenty of streamer options as the season goes along. I mean, guys like Kirk Cousins, Justin Herbert, Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, and Deshaun Watson are all drafted in the double-digit rounds, and every single one of those guys is capable of putting up QB1 weeks every week. But all of that being said, I was comfortable skipping on Anthony Richardson in the 6th because I knew there was still a chance that I'd be able to get Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, or Jordan Love with my pick in the 7th. Now, you'll see Richardson went, Burrow went, Dak went, and Kyler Murray went. But one of those guys left is still Jordan Love. So I should take him here. But I won't. Because, and this is something I mentioned in the last episode, you always want to pay attention to what your opponents are doing with their drafts. And in my case, after I make this selection, there are 2 teams after me that each get to pick 2 players. Both of those teams have a strong quarterback already. Team 11 has Lamar Jackson. Team 12 has Patrick Mahomes, meaning I can feel relatively confident that they're not going to take Jordan Love. They're not going to take a second quarterback. That would be terrible roster construction from their standpoint. And if they do it, I'll be fine. I can just stream along the way. Meanwhile, Team 11 only has 2 running backs at this point. Good chance that they might be trying to get a third at some point. It's a little bit more pressing. It's a little bit more needy, if you will, for me to go out and find that next running back. And for me, that pick is Zamir White. All right, so after picking Zamir White in the 7th, we did get Jordan Love in the 8th, and we are back on the clock with the 10th pick in round 9, officially pick 106. As it stands, we got Jordan Love as our QB1, and if you'll watch episode 17, I love me some Jordan Love in 2024 fantasy football, thrilled to get him in the 8th round. Then we got Breece Hall holding down the every week RB1 spot. We got Drake London as our every week wide receiver 1, Jalen Waddle, our every week wide receiver 2, Cooper Kupp as our every week wide receiver 3, and then we also have T. Higgins, who's a flex candidate to go along with David Montgomery and Zamir White. Now, as it stands, every week we're going to have some decisions to make between who we want to be our RB2, between David Montgomery versus Zamir White, and whoever loses that battle every week will battle T. Higgins to see who's in the flex spot. Now, some weeks, that's going to be an obvious decision. Other weeks, that's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really hard to choose which one of those 3 guys needs to stay on the bench. And in those weeks, myself and Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers are sure to reference Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's weekly heat map, which is what you see on the screen. This is the tool that started this entire business. It's a resource I put together every single week that offers contextual analysis telling you what to expect from every single player in every single game, every single week. On the left side, it gives you a quick cheat sheet of game information. It's going to tell you who's playing who. It's going to color code the over-under to let you know which games are going to be higher scoring versus lower scoring. It's going to color code the spread to give you an idea of which games will be close, which games will be blowouts, which is going to have implications in volume in fantasy football. So, for example, in this example, Seahawks-Cowboys. Cowboys were favored by 2 scores. We can probably expect Dallas to run the ball frequently in the second half while they try to kill the clock, whereas Seattle's going to be throwing the ball frequently in the second half as they try to catch up to Dallas. It's going to color code the implied team total, so you know which teams in the NFL are expected to score the most touchdowns. That has fantasy football implications. And it's going to give you a quick reference guide in the form of a cheat sheet that shows how each defense performs against each position. So in this example, we're going to look at this game number 4, Broncos versus Texans. You'll see that there is a number 1 next to the Broncos underneath running back. That tells you that the Broncos at this point in the season were giving up the number 1 most PPR points per game to opposing running backs, whereas they were actually pretty strong against wide receivers. Broncos were holding enemy wide receivers to the 26th fewest, I guess for lack of a better term, PPR points. And then over on the right side, every single player, 250 or more of them, are inside the heat map in one of 5 different columns. The blue column, which is where we expect eruption games. This is where all of the data points to a possible explosion for that player. Everything, the stars are aligning perfectly for that player. The green column, which tells you these are players we'd feel pretty good about. They should have an above average game. This is a good player to have in your lineup. The yellow column, which is just meh, this player, there's nothing in the data that suggests a particularly good game or a particularly bad game. We should expect average results from the players in this column. The D column, the orange column, the feel gross column, which tells you, hey, all of the data is suggesting that this week's game might not be one of their better games. If you can afford to put them on the bench, this is probably the week to do it. And then column F are the players you shouldn't even be considering for fantasy football. If you want to know why that player is labeled or listed where they are inside the heat map, all you have to do is click on their name, and it is going to tell you every single thing you need to know about that player in their upcoming game that week. It's going to start out by telling you what to expect from that game. In this case, it was the Miami Dolphins versus the Washington Commanders. Is it going to be a high-scoring game, a low-scoring game? Is it going to be a shootout? Are the Dolphins going to win by a lot, going to lose by a lot? How should we expect the volume to shake out in fantasy football? And then it's going to drill down to the individual level, the micro level, and it's going to tell you about, in this case, Tua Tagovailoa himself. How has he been performing? Is he trending in the right direction? Is he trending in the wrong direction? Are the running back in this case, Tony Pollard, is he losing touches to Rico Dowdle? Is he separating from Rico Dowdle? How does the defense he's going to go up against, how do they perform against running backs? How do they perform against running backs that are specifically like Tony Pollard? It's going to tell you every single thing you could possibly want to know about every single player in every single game, every single week. And this is the main resource that my subscribers are using every single week to set their lineups, dominate their leagues, and even take down DFS contests and cash in on NFL bets. We are back on the clock with the third pick in the 10th round. This is now pick 111. We took Christian Watson with our last selection, making it our 5th wide receiver compared to 3 running backs. Now, you're probably at some point, you're staring at this open spot in our roster, tight end. We don't have a single tight end yet. And that wasn't by design. I didn't come into this draft saying, I'm not going to touch tight end. It just didn't fall to me. Things didn't break that way, right? In the 5th round, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, all those guys were off the board. We took T. Higgins. We were going to be looking at George Kittle when it came back, but George Kittle wasn't available. So once we reach a certain point in the draft, and usually for me that point is Jake Ferguson. So we got Sam Laporta, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride. Who am I missing? Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram, George Kittle, Jake Ferguson. Those 9 guys. Once we get past those 9 guys, I'm pretty much out when it comes to looking for an every week number 1 tight end, a guy that I'm going to put in my lineup every single week. Instead, if I miss out on those guys, for me, it's going to be a streaming scenario. Every single week, I'm going to be basically looking for a new tight end to put in my lineup. Yeah, I could grab the best available, who I don't even... Dalton Schultz at that? No, Dalton Schultz isn't even here. Cole Kmet. I could grab Cole Kmet as the best available because I simply need one. But candidly, it's a waste because unless you're expecting Cole Kmet to get you 10-plus points a game or whatever it's going to be, why waste a draft pick on him? And in my opinion, I mean, you got DJ Moore, you got Keenan Allen, you got Rome Odunze, he's no slouch. The guy's going to get his fair share of targets. They got DeAndre Swift there. How frequently is Cole Kmet truly going to get me 10 PPR points per game? I don't feel comfortable at all putting Cole Kmet in my lineup every single week. Instead, that's, again, where I'm going to come back to the heat map, pop up the streamers tab, and look at what Basement Brewed Fantasy Football is recommending for tight ends every single week. So when I'm in a pinch, when injuries strike, when bye weeks start to occur and you're in a pinch and you need to find a defense, a kicker, a tight end, or a quarterback you can stream, that's where Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's heat map comes in handy. So every single week, I'm going to be looking at the Pat Freiermuths, the Juwan Johnsons, the Taysom Hills, the Logan Thomases, or whatever that's going to be in 2024. That's a much better use of my time and a much better input into my lineup than just grabbing Cole Kmet because he's the best available tight end and thrusting him into my lineup. Instead, I'm just going to ignore tight end. I'm going to ignore quarterback because I already got it. And we're just going to keep filling up the spaces that take up the majority of our starting lineup. That's wide receiver and that's running back. And in this case, the Curtis Samuel, I do love Curtis Samuel this year. I do want to try and balance out the running back to wide receiver ratio a little bit because I invested so heavily at wide receiver early, so I'd much rather look at running backs if there are any that speak to me. And sure, lo and behold, the one running back available in these upcoming tiers is Tyjae Spears. The fact that this is a PPR league, I do like the idea of grabbing Tyjae Spears. He's a solid fill-in flex. It's not like we're counting on him to be an every week starter. He's a guy who I can plug and play as matchups allow me to into my RB2 or even into my flex spot. Tyjae Spears it is, and it's not really all that difficult. All right, we are back on the clock. Pick 10, round 11, pick 130 overall. We only got 5 picks left. We're going to be 130, 135, 154, 159, and 178. Now, I mentioned in the last episode that if it's me, personally, when I'm doing my own draft, unless my league forces me to, or unless there's some sort of weird waiver wire rules or it costs money to use waiver claims, whatever, unless my league forces me to, I'm not even drafting a defense or a kicker. And in this case, candidly, I literally wouldn't even be drafting a tight end. None. At this stage of the draft, having not gotten anybody up to Jake Ferguson, I personally would not draft a tight end. Again, I would come over to the heat map, pop open the streamers tab, and then right before week 1 kicks off, I would grab a streamer defense, a streamer kicker, and a streamer tight end. Okay? Now, in this draft, understanding that that's going to make people comfortable, I am going to use picks 13, 14, and 15 on a tight end, kicker, and defense. But again, usually I would not. Instead, I prefer, especially if I'm drafting early in August and there's several weeks before the season kicks off. So if you're drafting in early August and you're not forced to take a kicker or a defense, I highly recommend instead using that bench space on running backs that have big time upside. If the guy in front of them goes down or if they leapfrog the guy in front of them, using those bench spaces on high upside running backs, especially if you're drafting in early August. And right here is the perfect example. Joshua Palmer, Rashid Shaheed, I like those guys. I think they're fine for this year, but I don't see a need to add them to our fantasy team in this particular draft. Same would go for Brandon Cooks, Jerry Jeudy, though I do really like Jerry Jeudy. Then you get to the name Zach Charbonnet. On his own, Zach Charbonnet might do a thing or two from time to time this year, but ultimately he's going to be running behind Kenneth Walker. Now, as a football player, as a talent, as a prospect coming out of the draft last year, Zach Charbonnet was one of my favorite running backs. I loved him. He's still a second-round pick for the Seahawks, and if anything were to happen to Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet instantly becomes an RB2 in fantasy football with RB1 upside. In fact, if anything were to happen to Kenneth Walker and I had Zach Charbonnet on my team, he would likely be in my lineup more frequently than both David Montgomery and Zamir White, guys that I drafted a few rounds ago. So instead of forcing myself to take a tight end that I'm going to end up dropping, I'm going to end up booting to the waiver wire, instead of taking a kicker or a defense that I'm going to end up cutting, I want to use these roster spots, especially if it's early August, on those running backs that have massive upside if anything happens to the guy in front of them or one of their backfield competitors during a preseason game or training camp or what have you. This is where I'm taking a guy like Zach Charbonnet who carries legitimate RB1 upside if he gets volume and things break right for him. Easy pick here. We are back on the clock. Third pick, 12th round, pick 135 overall. There are 4 selections remaining in this draft: 135, 154, 159, and 178. Now, because of the draft capital that we've invested at wide receiver, I mean, we went heavy wide receiver early, which is not uncommon for me in 2024, but we can pretty much expect every week, most weeks, if not every week, Drake London, Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, and T. Higgins are going to be in the lineup most weeks. Now, the reason that I grabbed Christian Watson where I did was because the value was insane for one, but B, Christian Watson's the type of upside that I absolutely can envision being in my starting lineup at some point, whether I flex him over T. Higgins or maybe he has some, maybe something happens with Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, and I need to throw somebody in there. I can picture Christian Watson being in my starting lineup. That said, we're at a stage in this draft that, given the draft capital that I've spent, that I've invested on wide receivers, given the strength that we have at wide receiver, there's very few scenarios where I could see Joshua Palmer, Brandon Cooks, Jerry Jeudy, Dontavian Wicks, all these best remaining wide receivers. There's very few scenarios where I see them getting into my lineup. Meaning, for the remainder of this draft, more than likely, it's not a sure thing, but more than likely for the remainder of this draft, I am going to keep stockpiling those running backs that carry big-time upside should anything happen to the guy in front of them. The next available example of that in my rankings is Marshawn Lloyd. The Packers rookie running back that they drafted this year. I expect him to eventually offer standalone flex value in fantasy football, even if Josh Jacobs is healthy and on the field. But if anything happened to Josh Jacobs and Josh Jacobs went down, again, Marshawn Lloyd becomes an instant RB2 with some upside in fantasy football. That's exactly the type of upside that I want to stash. Is he taken already? I don't even see him. There he is. Okay. That is exactly the type of upside that I want to stash on my bench, especially, again, if I'm drafting in August. 3 picks left. We are in the 13th round, 10th pick. This is pick 154 overall. A few things to call your attention to. Number 1, take note of the fact that you can walk out of the 13th round with Aaron Rodgers. Okay? So if you miss out on those stud quarterbacks early, don't panic, because Aaron Rodgers is stupidly cheap in 2024 fantasy football drafts. Also, note that one of the biggest mistakes that fantasy football players make pretty frequently is rushing to grab top-tier defenses. And I talked about this at pretty great length in the last episode, but instead, like this here in the 13th round, somebody took the San Francisco 49ers. I get it. Great defense. You want to get a great defense. However, teams like the 49ers play teams like Aaron Rodgers and the Jets in week 1. That's not something I'm interested in putting into my lineup in fantasy football. Every week, you want to get as many fantasy football points as you possibly can, and putting your defense up against Aaron Rodgers is not a great way of doing that. Instead, I'm just going to skip on defense altogether, and I'm going to pick up somebody like Seattle, who hosts the Denver Broncos in week 1, who we don't know if it's going to be the MILF Hunter, Zach Wilson. We don't know if it's going to be Jarrett Stidham. We don't know if it's going to be Bo Nix. I would much rather use Seattle's defense at home against the Denver Broncos than use the 49ers defense against a chip on his shoulder, Aaron Rodgers. But 3 picks left. We still don't have a tight end. We still don't have a kicker. We still don't have a defense. And guess what? None of that is going to change. Because it's early August, we are going to keep stockpiling running backs with upside should anything happen to their teammate in the backfield over the next few weeks, during training camp, during preseason. Some of these guys could come into massive value spikes if things just break right for them in the next few weeks. Again, as it pertains to tight ends, kickers, defenses, we're just going to reference the Streamers tab on Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's weekly heat map, which is going to provide you a cheat sheet of defenses, kickers, quarterbacks, and tight ends that you can grab off waivers and slide into your lineup when you're in a pinch. A couple examples for week 1, if you're looking for some tight ends. Hunter Henry is on the Patriots. The Patriots don't really have a clear-cut number 1 wide receiver. I mean, Demario Douglas was great last year. They drafted Jalen Polk. But who's to say with a new coaching staff that Hunter Henry can't once again be one of the top targets in the Patriots offense? New England goes against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 1. Likely will be playing from behind. Likely will have to throw the ball plenty. Who's to say Hunter Henry can't rack up a couple garbage catches in week 1? You got Tyler Conklin, who is now Aaron Rodgers' number 1 tight end. The Jets we just talked about are going against the 49ers. That should be a good game to watch. That should be a competitive game. Tyler Conklin could get involved there. You got Jonnu Smith, the new tight end number 1 for the Miami Dolphins. He is going up against the Jaguars. That's got shootout potential written all over it. You got Jelani Woods, the tight end 1 for the Colts. They're going against the Houston Texans. They're going to have to throw the ball if they want to keep up with C.J. Stroud Stroud and company. There's a lot of tight ends here that we could just grab off waivers once this draft is over, plug them into our lineup, and then do it all over again in week 2. So instead, again, I'm going to keep stockpiling these running backs. Next one up is Jaleel McLaughlin. Although we already talked about him in the last episode, let's hop to Ray Davis, or actually, better yet, let's do it this way. Whichever one is closer. Looks like that's not going to work. And I'm just, whatever. We're going to go with Jaleel McLaughlin. Things have already been trending in the right direction for Jaleel McLaughlin over the last few weeks. I mean, there's been some reports of Javonte Williams battling for a roster spot in Denver, which is absolutely wild because he's widely been considered to be the RB1 in Denver. And if that, on the off chance that doesn't happen, Jaleel McLaughlin suddenly becomes the RB1 for the Denver Broncos. Easy pick in the 13th round. We also love us some Ray Davis. Now, if you listen to I don't remember which episode number it is, but if you listen, let me mute that. If you listen to a couple of the episodes that I did near and after the NFL draft, A, I love Ray Davis as a prospect. B, the fact that he went to Buffalo means there's a very, very good chance that he is going to be involved on day 1 for the Buffalo Bills. I love grabbing him, especially if anything were to happen to James Cook, and even if not, I expect Ray Davis to come into standalone flex value in 2024. He's a great flyer with a 14th round pick. And with our last pick number 15, I've kind of lost track of where we are because I've just been rambling. The next best running back, again, here's another rookie. I don't even know if he's on here. Kimani Vidal. Okay, he is not an option. So let me look for another one. So Kimani Vidal, if he's available as a late round stash, I love him because he is in a Chargers. I just talked about the Chargers backfield in the last episode. We talked about Gus Edwards, but Gus Edwards has long kind of been just a guy. And in Baltimore, you got just a guy, Gus Edwards. You got J.K. Dobbins, who's can't seem to stay healthy. And then, of course, you got Kimani Vidal, who John Harbaugh drafted this year in this year's draft. There's a good chance. I did a whole episode on Kimani Vidal a couple weeks back. He's an option with that last pick. Of course, he's not available. Somebody must have drafted him in this mock. So we're going to wrap this thing up with Tyrone Tracy, yet another rookie running back that I like for his chances of coming into significant volume in 2024. He's playing for the New York Giants, who no longer have Saquon Barkley. That's a massive void in their offense. They brought in Devin Singletary, but he's on his third team in as many years. He's certainly hasn't proven himself to be the workhorse back. You got Tyrone Tracy, who is a wide receiver by nature, great hands to catch the football. He's just a great last round pick that you can stash at the end of your bench that could possibly come into some value in PPR leagues. Again, I totally understand if this whole idea of just skipping tight end, kicker, and defense and just keep stocking up on running backs, I totally understand if that's uncomfortable or if that's not even allowed, right? You might play in a league where you're forced to take at least one of every position. But ultimately what we're trying to do, and keep in mind, those last few picks I just kind of rattled off, running backs in the back of my mind that I know I'm targeting late in rounds. But the whole idea is because we did this draft on July 30th, okay? It's not even August. Now, if this, of course, this is a mock, it's not a real league, but if it was, I would basically just want to sit on these guys, keep these guys on my bench, watch them in the preseason, keep an eye out for how they're going to be used even in a committee, and keep an eye out for if the guy in front of them gets hurt, gets traded, gets cut, whatever the case, right? Tyrone Tracy could take over for Devin Singletary at some point. Ray Davis would come into pretty big volume if James Cook went down, and even if he doesn't, Ray Davis might be the preferred short yardage type of guy. Jaleel McLaughlin could be the RB1 if Javonte Williams gets cut or traded. Marshawn Lloyd would be a massive hit if anything happened to Josh Jacobs. Same thing with Charbonnet if anything happened to Kenneth Walker. The idea is stashing these guys and hiding them away, and then right before week 1 kicks off, so in a month plus, then we'll make the decision of which 3 of these guys we need to drop, or maybe somebody will be out that we can put on injured reserve. We'll hop over to the week 1 heat map, which is not ready yet, and take a look at the streamers tab. Grab our defense, grab our kicker, grab our tight end, and plug them in. Now that you know all my secrets, come and beat me up on the fantasy football field. In partnership with Circa and Full-Time Fantasy, I am hosting a fantasy football championship, a 12-team PPR league with a grand prize of $50,000. You heard me correctly. You can win over $2,500 just in our 12-team league alone, and the top 4 participants in our 12-team league are automatically entered into the grand prize round where they can win up to $50,000. It costs $349 to play, and you can use the link that we left for you in the show notes to learn more and enter the contest. But you gotta hurry, because I'm taking the first 11 that sign up on a first-come, first-served basis. That's all for today's episode. If you have a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, just leave it in the comments below and it just might be featured in a future episode of Inside the 20. Remember, this is my birthday episode. I'm about to turn 36, and as a way of celebrating, I am offering 36% off of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide and or heat maps to anybody who joins Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server, which is something that, quite frankly, you should just do anyway if you like fantasy football. The link to join our Discord server is in the show notes, and once you join, you'll automatically get an email that contains that super secret discount code for 36% off our heat maps and our draft guide. I'll see you on the fantasy football field. Cheers. This brew's for you.